How long can you keep the army in the Punjab, and can you control the situation once you've withdrawn them?
We've already announced that the army will stay there only as long as absolutely necessary, which means that when they've cleared the Golden Temple complex.
This is going to have repercussions all over India.
Indian government has signed their own death warrant.
She'd been walking along this path to the house when a trusted security guard, a Sikh with 15 years' service, opened fire.
The assassination was vicious, barbaric, terrible.
This is not the time of rejoicing. All the community in this country should behave calmly.
Violence doesn't pay, and we are very sorry that more lives have been lost.
Sikhs, Hindus and Muslims came to mourn Indira Gandhi, united in sorrow and grief.
The coffin was draped in the national colours of India, green, white and saffron. Some of the crowd chanted, "Indira, blood for blood." Mobs of angry Hindus attacking Sikh businesses, looking for Sikh people and burning Sikh cars as Hindus continued their revenge against the Sikhs.
But the situation is extremely grim.
Even when Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated more than 36 years ago, I do not think a thing like this happened. This is the most unfortunate chapter in the history of this country.
The Indian government is telling everybody that the situation is normal. There's nothing to worry about, indeed claiming that many of the reports of trouble were grossly exaggerated. But at two camps today, we've seen 20 or 30,000 people, many of them living in appalling conditions, some are suffering from terrible injuries.
And are you content and satisfied that you can control the situation in the Punjab? You haven't let it get out of control by your action?
I think the people will control it.
The Golden Temple, the holiest shrine of the Sikh religion, sits isolated in a lake at the centre of a sprawling section of Amritsar city in the Punjab. Sikh extremists have set up their headquarters inside. The city is walled, but in the last few days its inhabitants have reinforced their barricades against what they expect will be an attack by the Indian army on their temple. 6 months of violence and unrest between Hindus and Sikhs is clearly coming to a head. In the last 3 days alone, fighting between the two religious groups has left nearly 30 people killed. The Sikhs want political and religious concessions from the government, but the deep-seated animosity between Hindus and Sikhs is at the root of the violence. The Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, yesterday sent her troops into the Punjab and up to the walls of the holy city. She also imposed a 36-hour curfew and banned all road and rail movements. The Sikhs responded by launching a campaign of civil disobedience. It is likely that this will lead to more violence, which will put pressure on Mrs. Gandhi to order her troops into the walled city and into the temple. That, say the Sikhs, will mean holy war.
The Sikh Golden Temple in Amritsar is an unlikely location for a shootout between Indian authorities and militant Sikhs. The Sikh religion preaches tolerance and understanding between peoples, yet its young warriors are so upset by what they regard as injustice towards their people from the central government, they've fortified the precincts of their temple. The government maintains that the extensive temple buildings are sheltering wanted men who've murdered for their cause. The forces have so far not entered the temple itself, though they've threatened to if the militants don't surrender. Some commentators expect a shootout in the buildings around the temple. The risk for the Indian government is that far from settling the matter well before the election due in the next few months, the arrival of the army might just touch off the bloodbath everyone fears. Those who died today were from the moderate faction. 36 more men joined the long line of Sikh martyrs. Many fear that more will have to die before peace returns to the Golden Temple in Amritsar.
The Punjab has been cut off from the rest of India, and the army has taken over control under the command of a Sikh general. It's a sensitive area because it lies close to the border with Pakistan, and the Punjab produces a large proportion of the country's food. Amritsar is the Sikhs' holy city. The temple is a sprawling 15-acre complex in the heart of the city. The main 400-year-old temple shrine is in the centre of a man-made lake. The leader of the Akali Dal party, Moderate Sant Longowal, had his headquarters in a residential building to the side of the main temple. He and his followers have surrendered to the 400 soldiers or so in the temple area and moved to a safer place. The leader of the more extreme faction, Sant Bhindranwale, and his followers are barricaded in a building nearer the religious heart of the complex, where the Sikh holy book is normally kept at night. Bhindranwale and his followers have fortified the building and are using mortars, rocket launchers and light machine guns in their defence of the temple. The Indian government says that 2 areas of the complex are in the hands of Sikh militants. Some reports say the army has given the militants an ultimatum to leave, while government officials suggest the Sikhs may plan to blow up the temple rather than surrender. Journalists have been compelled to leave the Punjab. 500,000 Sikhs now live in this country and they're angry at the invasion of their shrine. This morning in Southall, members of the Sikh temple boarded a coach to travel to the Indian High Commission to protest vigorously but peacefully. Prominent British Sikhs have warned the situation in Amritsar is explosive.
Mrs. Gandhi has galvanized all the Sikhs of all persuasions on this issue and on this issue alone. There have been differences on question of policy and emphasis, as some people, the press people call it, moderate and extremist. But on this issue and this issue alone, everybody is behind whatever the Sikh leaders do.
Thousands of more moderate Sikhs in Britain are now expressing support for the more extreme organisations who demand the establishment of a separate Sikh state called Khalistan.
All over the world, not only in this country, in Canada, America and all over the world, the Sikhs are now united, and this war will now carry on till we defeat India.
Once the Sikhs, they feel that the Golden Temple has been invaded, it will create a very, very long-term effect on their minds.
Do you think it will unite all Sikhs, the action of the government?
It has already united, not will. It has already united.
This afternoon, those Sikhs who travelled from Southall held a noisy protest outside the Indian High Commission in the Aldwych. They plan a peaceful march through London on Sunday. Thousands are expected to attend. The Sikhs will remember the last time they demanded more autonomy and India imposed martial law. That was in 1919 and resulted in the massacre of 300 Sikhs. Sikhs in London fear that many more will die in and around the Golden Temple in the next few days.
In London, which has a large Sikh community, there was a noisy demonstration outside the Indian High Commission. Mrs. Gandhi must have been aware that her action would provoke scenes like this. Before the storming of the temple, a senior Sikh representative came to London to explain the government's position to Sikh leaders here. They were due to meet him last night, but many boycotted the meeting when the news of the battle came through. As he left Heathrow this morning, even Mrs. Gandhi's man seemed to have his doubts.
You have to give allowance to the government also that this thing was going on for too long. Violence outside the Golden Temple being directed from inside. And but you see, it's a very sad and a very tragic situation which has developed, because it is the saddest day for my life that this should have happened inside the Golden Temple.
Today's events suggest that Sikh unrest may spread beyond the Punjab. Today's fighting was centred in 2 areas with substantial Sikh minorities, Kashmir and Delhi. But there are also significant Sikh communities in Punjab's neighbour Haryana, and in Calcutta and in Bombay. And throughout the country, the Sikhs play an important part in the business and agricultural communities. The danger for Mrs. Gandhi is that her action has turned Sant Bhindranwale into a martyr in the ancient Sikh tradition of martyrdom. That would unite the Sikh community behind his brand of extremism. Until now, there's been moderate Sikh opposition to the methods which have brought 2 years of violence to Punjab.
Well, the radicals are certainly going to have a lot more sympathy. The moderate element is the biggest casualty. Those that favoured any sort of negotiation with Indira Gandhi have had the very ground cut from under their feet. They've got no position now.
What sort of effect is that likely to have on the way people behave? I mean, the campaign against the government, how will that change?
This will certainly take a far harder line. It's got to, because there is no means of negotiating with the government left. They have thrown down a challenge to Sikhs. We can subdue you by force. The Sikhs now pick up the gauntlet. There is little they can do but respond in kind.
I was always wanting to avoid it, and I was always recommending to the government that this should be avoided by conceding the demands well in time. But I was also asking that the extremists should have no right to be in the temple, and to use their mortar guns and the machine guns and to have so much of ammunition inside, you know, because this is how you destroy the sanctity of the temple yourself.
The Golden Temple symbolizes so much in India. Its foundation stone was laid by a Muslim at the request of a Sikh. It symbolizes communal harmony. Indira Gandhi has destroyed communal harmony. It's destroyed trust in the government. This is going to have repercussions all over India. Already Indira Gandhi is in a very weak position in many states.
So they have killed our religious head, and they have destroyed our golden temple, and that's unbearable will shock to every Sikh all over the world, and the position is very, very critical. Everybody is upset. His feelings are killed very, very hard. And moreover, I want to tell, with this action, Indian government has signed their own death warrant.
The Sikhs have promised violence against Indian organisations in Britain this week in retaliation for the deaths in Amritsar. They vowed Mrs. Gandhi will pay a heavy price for the attack on their temple, calling for her death. Men wore orange ribbons, symbols of warriors prepared to die for their cause. As the march moved slowly through central London, sightseers were handed leaflets calling for British intervention to win a separate province for Sikhs in India, or even a Sikh government in exile here. Last week, Sikhs attacked the Indian High Commission with petrol bombs. Today, police were ready for them outside the building, encircling the area and diverting the march. Protesters took out their frustration on more effigies of Mrs. Gandhi, setting fire to them as they walked. There were only 4 arrests for minor public order offences. Police commended the marchers on a peaceful demonstration. Anne Lucas, ITN, Central London.
Tonight, for the first time, the Indian government allowed cameras into a news conference called to explain the details of the battle fought between the army and the Sikh extremists on the 5th and 6th of June. The battle ended with the storming of the Golden Temple and the death of Sant Bhindran Wali, the Sikhs' militant leader. The Home Secretary, Mr. Wali, said the government had no alternative but to use armed force. Intelligence reports suggested the militants had received training in Kashmir and Pakistan, which enabled them to transform the Golden Temple into a virtually impregnable fortress.
It is quite clear now that it was a very deep-seated conspiracy to create terror in the state of Punjab with the help of certain foreign powers, and ultimately to try for a separate state.
The news from Delhi tonight is that the first foreign press party will be visiting Amritsar tomorrow. But it's highly unlikely that cameras and tape recorders will be allowed. The situation obviously remains tense. The government say that there are still large numbers of terrorists operating in the area. They've moved out of the Golden Temple and into the surrounding countryside. The army have discovered large quantities of arms. Jane Corbin, ITN, in Delhi.
The leader of the Sikh government in exile is Dr Jagjit Singh Chohan, a former deputy speaker of the Punjab State Assembly. This morning he was meeting leaders of Britain's Sikh community. The majority of the world's 12 million Sikhs live in India, but 500,000 or so live in Britain, and there are large communities in other Commonwealth countries. Dr Chohan and his followers want an independent Sikh homeland, which they've already named Khalistan, or Land of the Pure, and over the past few days they've even been issuing passports, currency and postage stamps.
Our final concept is nothing less than independent, sovereign state of Khalistan, the Republic of Khalistan. That is nothing less than that.
Meanwhile, in London and around the world, Sikh families have been answering the call for a day of mourning for Jarnail Singh Bhindranwala and others who died during and after the storming of the Golden Temple in Amritsar. Families have been fasting and praying throughout the day. John Underwood, ITN in West London.
I don't think we could have done anything else. Some people feel we should have acted earlier, and some that we should not have acted. It's difficult to say whether we could have acted earlier. I think we wanted to give the maximum time to those inside, to whom we were pointing out that there was, that we had clear information about the accumulation of arms, about giving shelter to criminals and murderers and so on. And we were hoping to, that they themselves would act and not allow these people to use such a sacred and holy place as a shelter. Simultaneously, we were carrying on talks with the members of the Akali Dal, although this was the view of most of our parliament and so on, that we should do so. And we genuinely wanted to come to an agreement. But I had doubts whether the agreement would solve the other problem. I mean, it would solve one part of the problem, that is with the Akali Dal probably, but that the others, but that they would be able to control the situation, I was not sure.
You have spoken in the past few days of external forces meddling in India's affairs. What exactly do you mean?
As you've probably seen in our own press, that weapons have been found with external markings, so presumably they've been smuggled across. Now, which elements there are which are interested or are interfering is difficult to say.
Pakistan has been mentioned. Do you think this is a possibility?
Well, some of the arms have probably come from there, but as I said, who was involved, it's difficult to say.
You've detained most of the leadership of the Sikhs political party. What chance do you now have of negotiating with moderate Sikhs?
Well, firstly, we have not arrested most of them. Just a few of them. Most of the Akalis are out. It's the people we are trying to arrest are the terrorists. So far as talks are concerned, it's difficult to say because, of course, some of these people were in the temple and they presumably knew what was going on, so they could have done something about it.
How long can you keep the army in the Punjab, and can you control the situation once you've withdrawn them?
We've already announced that the army will stay there only as long as absolutely necessary, which means that when they've cleared the Golden Temple complex of these illegal arms and the fortifications that were built up, and to see if there are any more terrorists in there.
But do you
and also to comb some of the villages. But that, of course, is not entirely the army. The police and others are also doing that.
But do you not feel that once the army's been withdrawn and Sikhs are able to go to the Golden Temple, they may react with a certain amount of emotion which could lead to violence?
Well, there's no doubt that people are reacting and will react with emotion, but I don't think it's correct to use the word Sikh. Our action was not against the Sikhs, it was not against the Sikh religion, it was not against the Golden Temple. It was against a very small, comparatively small group, in which we believe there were other people too, not only Sikhs, who were desecrating the holy place. And the action was against them, it was not against the others. And I think that by and large the Sikhs are realizing that.
And are you content and satisfied that you can control the situation in the Punjab? You haven't let it get out of control by your action?
I think the people will control it. In this country, there's no one person who controls things. You know, we have to take the people along with us.
The seeds of the unrest behind today's assassination were sown with the invasion of the Golden Temple in Amritsar in June. The fortification and occupation of the temple by Sikh extremists was the culmination of a 2-year campaign for a separate Sikh state in the Punjab, which had been fought by both terrorist and political means. Mrs. Gandhi lost patience. Her troops moved into the Punjab, they surrounded the temple, and they stormed it. After bitter fighting, the rebels were driven out, and the army moved in to clear up the mess. It's thought as many as 1,000 had died, and the stones of the Sikh Holy of Holies were stained with blood. In September, the World Sikh Convention said they'd storm the temple if the government troops weren't removed. That concession was made at the end of the month, but the violence in the Punjab flared up again at the beginning of October. In London today, the self-proclaimed Sikh government in exile, they call themselves the Republic of Khalistan, their name for the Punjab, said that all Sikhs wanted to be the one to kill Mrs. Gandhi. Their president offered little apology for his claim that his commandos had done it, and he said that the whole Sikh community now supported his brand of separatist extremism, and he warned of more trouble to come.
Sikhs will never forget it, what has been done to them, and it is still not over. It is only the beginning, I tell you.
So who else is a target? Is Mrs. Gandhi's son a target, for example?
No, I won't specifically say, but he's definitely a target. And he should be careful, I tell you.
What about the president, who is himself a Sikh?
I think president may not be the immediate aim, but if he apologizes, if he satisfies the Sikhs that he was not responsible for ordering this attack, goes to Akal Takht and apologizes from the whole nation, perhaps he may be excused.
What will it actually take to end the violence?
Creation of Khalistan by very peaceful means and giving Sikhs their due. That is the only solution. There is nothing less than that which Sikhs will accept.
The writer Naomi Mitchison, a friend of Mrs. Gandhi's, described her qualities.
I think immense courage. It was, of course, partly physical courage, but you can't separate these things out. And, of course, courage tends to make people fairly tough.
Did Mrs. Gandhi have to force herself to do the unpalatable things she had to do, or did it come easy to her?
I think it came fairly easy. I mean, if once you've been in the firing line, I mean, you get old soldiers who are like this. You have soft spots, but I think in general she was pretty tough.
Where did she get the toughness from?
Oh, it's in the family.
The political ruthlessness in Indira Gandhi, which allowed her to run India her way for so long, was well hidden behind a gentle manner, a graciousness which only occasionally gave way to flashes of impatience or anger. Now that India is without her tough leadership, is the sort of trouble and violence which led up to her death about to overwhelm the country? It's quite certain that such thoughts were behind the decision to swear in her son so speedily today. But it's by no means certain that Rajiv Gandhi and the power of the Gandhi name will be able to fill the sudden gap in political power as smoothly and as easily as some of India's politicians hope. Because for all the rallies and official visits of recent months, Rajiv Gandhi is short of political experience. It's only 4 years since the death of his brother Sanjay forced him into the roughhouse of politics, and the realization, however reluctant, that he might succeed his mother.
I've never thought of being Prime Minister. I've got a job at the moment of building up our party, and I think I've done a fairly good job in the past 2 years.
But the opposition to Rajiv Gandhi within the ruling Congress party, silenced while his mother was alive, may well now burst out in resentment at the sort of succession politics which brought Mrs. Gandhi herself to power. What may well help him and the people of India is the knowledge that while his mother may have made many political enemies at home, she made many friends abroad. Last year's Commonwealth Conference, when Mrs. Gandhi met the Queen, was one reminder of the fact that for all her troubles within India, Indira Gandhi was in the first division of world leaders, as today's worldwide tributes have shown.
Mrs. Thatcher came to sign the Book of Condolence. She told the High Commissioner she could not imagine an India without Mrs. Gandhi. The Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, added his signature.
It's a very, very sad thing, and a demonstration of the horrors of the world in which we live. All our sympathy goes out to the government and people of India.
Their names were the first in the book. The High Commission was then opened to the public. The High Commissioner said he'd received messages of sympathy from all sections of the Indian community in Britain, including Sikh leaders. He appealed to the 1.5 million people of Indian origin in Britain to remain calm.
As you know, there is a large Indian community here, and people are emotionally upset, and in a situation like this, sometimes some untoward instance can take place, and it is therefore I have appealed for calm.
The flag at half-mast outside India's Washington embassy, America's Secretary of State, George Shultz, arriving to pay his condolences within hours of the news breaking. His president close behind, breaking off from the American presidential campaign. Even though India is far more remote to Americans than to the British, the events in Delhi have provoked an atmosphere of shock here. No nation on earth understands the grief of assassination like the United States, and no president understands the threat of the assassin like Ronald Reagan. Inside, a photograph of Indira Gandhi on the desk in front of him. His was the first entry in the Book of Condolences. "May I offer my deepest sympathy," he wrote. They had met at the White House 2 years ago. Though Washington worried over India's relations with Moscow, Mrs. Gandhi was respected. Reagan and she, it seems, had corresponded in the past few months about the problems of terrorism. At the embassy, a senior Sikh diplomat looked on as he finished. Mr. Reagan views the battle against terrorism as almost his top priority. Mrs. Gandhi's death is viewed here in those terms, irrespective of the domestic details of how it happened. It has served to fuel the administration's conviction that the fight against terrorism must go forward in earnest. John Snow, News at 10, Washington.
The assassination was vicious, barbaric, terrible. For many of us, Indira Gandhi was a symbol of India. I talked with her often, not only as heads of government, but there was some always special quality about our talks. I think perhaps we had a unique understanding of one another's problems. She was not only a very strong, a very formidable personality, she was warm, humane, full of understanding. And I shall miss her very deeply.
I think they'll record her as a worker for international peace very effectively, and I think probably as one of the greatest of all of the voices, offering the rational arguments as well as the emotional arguments for a closer alliance between the third world and the industrial world, between the poor and the rich of the world. And I think she deserves a place in history on those grounds very definitely.
She was extremely unpretentious, she was extremely unegotistical, she did not seek to talk about herself as some politicians occasionally do. She was devoted to India and the unity of India and trying to preserve that unity. And it is, of course, a special tragic irony that she should have been killed in a sectarian battle, because she was the strongest opponent of sectarianism that India's ever known.
We will have to evaluate her period in office as a period during which India put down very important stakes for democracy. This wasn't now just a theoretical commitment. This was living through the hard nuts and bolts of democracy in a country as vast as India, with as many differences and divisions as India has. I believe throughout the Commonwealth today, when leaders will be recalling our summit in New Delhi just under a year ago, there will be a sense of confidence that India will see this through.
The last time I saw Mrs. Gandhi was when she was walking together with Mrs. Thatcher just in
in front of me at the funeral of President Andropov in Moscow. And the two women, obviously, their ideas were very different, and I think they had many conflicts, but they were where they worked together as prime ministers, and I suppose the two most prominent women in world politics. I think it is horrifying that violence is taking the place of reasoned argument, and I think that the obligation on those of us who remain committed to democratic politics is to continue to try to counter violence wherever it occurs by reasoned argument.
The reaction by London's largest Sikh community was at first one of celebration. But later other Sikhs called for reconciliation with Hindus.
Sikh people certainly are satisfied at this particular moment. But I would like them that this is not the time of rejoicing. They should, all the community in this country should behave calmly and should not pose any law and order problem in this country.
Very clear that violence doesn't pay. And we are very sorry that more lives have been lost. And we have come here to pray that this cult of violence stops.
Meanwhile, as other Indians in London grieved at Mrs. Gandhi's death, the revolutionary president of the outlawed Sikh Republic of Khalistan in northern India claims Mrs. Gandhi's successor, Rajiv, would face the same fate.
I think he is already on the hit list. It has been declared. There should be no ambiguity about it. Nobody should be in doubt.
And as the arguments continue, many of London's Sikh community were tonight still celebrating Mrs. Gandhi's death. Kim Sabido, News at 10, West London.
This morning, 12 days of national mourning began for all India. From first light, crowds began to gather at the house where Mrs. Gandhi's body was to lie in state. It was once the home of her father, Pandit Nehru. Escorted by an army detail, the coffin was draped in the national colours of India, green, white and saffron. Some of the crowd chanted, "Indira, blood for blood." They carried the coffin in. It was a symbolic end to her 17-year rule of India. Among the chief mourners this morning, her son, suddenly the leader of 730 million people. All day, TV and radio have carried his appeals for people not to let their grief turn to anger. But outside, the mobs had taken to the streets. From many parts of the country, and despite the presence of large numbers of police, there have been scores of clashes. Here in the capital, Delhi, we saw dozens of instances like this. Mobs of angry Hindus attacking Sikh businesses, looking for Sikh people, and burning Sikh cars. Reports of violence and deaths have been coming in from many parts of the country. And despite the presence of large numbers of police, there have been scores of clashes in the capital, as Hindus continued their revenge against the Sikhs. Sikhs drive most of the taxis in Delhi, and they were a major target for the mobs today. Sikh temples also came under attack. At the main temple in the center of the city, a Hindu mob threw stones and tried but failed to get into the building. Tonight, as a partial curfew was imposed, many Sikhs and police were on the streets guarding their property and their homes, but saying they were prepared to fight.
We don't want any protection from the police. If they allow us, we will see them.
I mean, you'll deal with it?
Yes, we will deal. We are not coward people, no?
Tonight, the situation appears a lot more calm, but that's because a partial curfew has removed many of the mobs from the streets. Nevertheless, we've passed scores of vehicles like this within the last half an hour, and much depends now on whether the TV and radio appeals for calm that are going out constantly here are in fact being heeded by both communities. Ken Rees, ITN, Delhi.
The day began with the moving of Mrs. Gandhi's body, carried in a gun carriage, to the home of her father, Pandit Nehru. She'll lie in state there until her funeral on Saturday. Thousands of people had gathered to see her at the gates of what has become a shrine to the Gandhi family. So many came to pay their respects to the Prime Minister that the security forces hustled them past her body as quickly as possible. Mrs. Gandhi's son Rajiv, the new Prime Minister, appealed for calm. By the time the day was over, some 400,000 had been through. and the press was so great that police had to hold together the hastily erected barriers. 40 people were injured in the crush. They chanted Mrs. Gandhi's name, and some cried for vengeance. Anti-Sikh feeling was expressed in more than words on the streets. Some Sikhs took refuge in one of Delhi's Sikh temples. The crowd surrounded the building and tried to drive them out. It's not clear how much of the violence was straightforward vandalism and looting, and how much was genuine communal anger. This evening, the national flag flew at half-mast on India's parliament. The nation is in mourning for its leader. It's also holding its breath to see how long the violence will continue. Jane Corbyn has just arrived in Delhi. She spoke to the political commentator Venkat Narayan.
This is the most serious incident in peacetime. Even when Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated more than 36 years ago, I do not think a thing like this happened. This is the most unfortunate chapter in the history of this country.
What about the role of the army? They're out in large numbers tonight in Delhi and in other major cities. Do you think that that's right?
Well, I suppose there is no other go. You know, you need the army to maintain peace and law and order, because the people are in a very disturbed condition. They could not imagine that Mrs. Gandhi would have been shot dead by our own security guards, and people are very angry, and they just went berserk in all the cities. You see, 15 million Sikhs live in this country, more than half of them in Punjab, the rest are scattered all over the country. And Delhi is the city where the largest number of Sikhs outside Punjab live. And people just let out their anger by bashing up the Sikhs and burning their property, setting fire and looting. Antisocial elements also got into the fray. So you needed the army to bring law and order back on the rails.
How do you think the new Prime Minister is coping with the situation?
He's the youngest man to have become the Prime Minister of this country, and he has a tremendous amount of goodwill among the people. The senior and the young elements in the Congress party are with him. The bureaucracy is with him. The sympathy of the people, millions of people all over the country, is with him at the moment. If he has so many things going, and the army also, you know, in this country there is no history of coups and things like that, the army also will back him to the hilt. So in a situation like that, everything is, you know, there for him. I'm sure he'll make a good show, hopefully. One has to give him time and see how he shapes up.
Buildings are still burning in Delhi. Today, the new Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, met members of the opposition parties who joined him in appealing for calm. The new Prime Minister has appointed 4 cabinet ministers, but he's reserved the other portfolios for himself. Tonight, Indian television warned Delhi residents of the 24-hour curfew imposed this evening, saying that troops would be moving into the center of the city. Tonight, as I drove through the streets of Delhi, there was a sense of eerie calm, deserted streets in a normally busy city. Meanwhile, heads of state have already begun arriving here for the funeral on Saturday. Jane Corbyn, ITN, Delhi.
They came to mourn Indira Gandhi, Sikhs, Hindus and Muslims united in sorrow and grief.
Only one day before her death, she was speaking to her people who gathered there in thousands to listen. She said, "If I die for my people, I will be proud." And next very day, she was killed by her own bodyguards.
A Sikh community leader said Mrs. Gandhi had made some mistakes, but he said, "We all joined together to pray for her." Tonight, Southall is quiet, but to guard against possible trouble, the police here are seeking a ban on political marches, and leaders of the Indian communities say they support the ban. John Underwood, News at 10, West London.
The army has orders to shoot looters and troublemakers on sight as Delhi begins clearing up after its worst riots for nearly 40 years. At least 60 people died, hundreds more were injured as Hindu mobs took their revenge on the Sikh community for the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi by 2 Sikhs. During the night, Sikhs were pulled from cars, some burnt to death or beaten up. Many Hindus were also injured as the clashes continued. A first count this morning revealed over 2,500 burnt-out vehicles, while scores of homes, factories, shops and businesses were burnt out by frenzied mobs. There are reports coming in now of shooting in parts of the city. The widespread violence of yesterday has calmed down this morning, but a curfew is still in force. Foreigners have been trapped in their luxury hotels in the city centre, including the members of the English cricket touring team. Already the first 2 matches of the tour have been cancelled, the rest are in jeopardy. They sat in their hotel this morning, anxiously awaiting news, worried about what might await them on the streets.
Well, obviously we've come out here to try and play some cricket. That's always been the idea. Events have overtaken us somewhat. We are in the hands of others who know better, as it were, to decide how safe we are and what we ought to be doing.
Eventually, the team were taken under escort to the British High Commission, where, on the carefully manicured lawns, they attempted a light practice session. It's almost the only place in India where they could safely practice today, and it certainly delighted the few small boys who turned up to watch. On the streets, almost no one is to be seen. Normally, this city centre boulevard would be crowded with thousands of people. Now, troops and police outnumber members of the public. Almost all shops are closed. Already there are shortages of food, water and other essentials. There's no public transport either, so long as the curfew lasts. Only in one place were they working today, at the field where tomorrow Indira Gandhi will be cremated according to Hindu tradition. It's just a few hundred yards from the shrine of Mahatma Gandhi. Without question, it'll be one of the biggest funerals ever seen in recent years, as well as the thousands of visiting dignitaries, heads of state and other VIPs. Some 3 or 4 million people are expected to try to follow the funeral procession as it wends its way through the streets of Delhi. And only then, when it's over, can India begin to address itself to the really important and for some worrying question. How is India going to get on without Mrs. Gandhi at the helm after 17 long years? Ken Rees, News at 1, New Delhi.
The Indian Army has been called in to protect Delhi's terrified Sikh community, the largest outside the Punjab. Sikh houses and temples have been torn down and set on fire. There have been reports of Sikhs being burnt alive, and Hindu mobs 100 strong attacking women and children. The families who've not been able to flee the city are in hiding, barricaded in their homes. For many months, the Sikhs have been demanding, often violently, a bigger say in their own affairs. Now, the Hindus are fighting back. But many claim to be ashamed of the attacks by their community on the Sikhs since the assassination of Indira Gandhi. They claim most Hindus want to live in peace with their neighbours.
No, I think it's only because of the anti-social elements in the city, and they took advantage of the situation. But it's not a religious fight between the Hindus and the Sikhs.
But the Sikhs are not reassured. They say their Hindu neighbours turned a deaf ear to their cries. Some Sikhs claim to have telephoned police stations for help again and again, but received no response. MP Khushwant Singh is a prominent member of the Sikh community. Last night he fled from a mob gathered outside his house.
But the situation is extremely grim. For the act of 3 Sikhs in killing Mrs. Gandhi, it would seem that a community of over 13 million Sikhs are being held to ransom. There have been acts of violence against Sikhs and their property in practically every part of this country without exception. And I have yet to hear of any instances where their Hindu neighbors have come to their help. Sikhs are beginning to feel totally alienated and have faced the very grim prospect of having to decide whether they're going to live in this country or get out.
The 3 Sikhs who killed Mrs. Gandhi and sparked off the violence were almost certainly not acting alone. Details of a conspiracy have begun to emerge. One of the Sikh security guards who shot Indira Gandhi has revealed that he and his 2 accomplices took a vow at a Sikh temple to kill her. And he says that another Sikh guard, one of the Prime Minister's security force, also swore to kill Rajiv Gandhi. The whole operation, according to this man who survives, he says was masterminded by a Major General in the Indian Army. The man who's revealed all this is now under armed guard in the Lohai hospital. Around him lie hundreds of badly injured Sikhs, victims of Hindu fury. Earlier today, when we tried to film these Sikhs, an enraged Hindu mob attacked us and seized our pictures.
The Sikhs have abandoned their burnt and looted stores in the old city. They've always been a prosperous business community, living in relative harmony with their neighbours. In the past, it's always been Muslims who clashed with Hindus. Intercommunal violence bred of religious intolerance.
It doesn't make any sense. Hindus and Sikhs are related to each other. They intermarry in the cities. My own daughter is married to a Hindu. It just doesn't add up what has happened here, and the only way I can explain it is that a pent-up sense of envy is turned into a sense of hatred because the Sikhs are doing better than the other communities, and it hurts the people's eyes, and therefore what they've done in most cases, apart from burning Sikh temples, is to loot Sikh property.
What do you think will happen now?
Unless the government is able to contain this violence against the Sikhs and somehow assuage their feelings, enter into some kind of agreement with their leaders, there will be an inevitable exchange of populations. The Sikhs feel insecure here, they'll be driven out of the country into the Punjab, and in turn the Hindus will be driven out from the Punjab. We are repeating a scene that took place in 46-47 when Pakistan was formed. Well, I hope it doesn't happen, because the country's already paid a very heavy price for what happened in 46 and 47, and we can't really afford to go on breaking up this country.
The Soviet Premier Nikolai Tikhonov and the American Secretary of State George Shultz, President Zia of Pakistan and the Vice Premier of China Yao Yilin will be amongst the dozens of presidents and premiers presenting India with a major security problem tomorrow. The 4 British party leaders, together with Princess Anne, will have a special branch bodyguard from Britain. The funeral 4 years ago of Mrs. Gandhi's son Sanjay showed what tomorrow will be like. But tomorrow, those massive hysterical crowds will be even bigger, with the added danger of communal anger at the assassination. From her lying in state at her childhood home, Mrs. Gandhi's body will be borne in the morning on an open carriage through Delhi streets lined with troops and mourners, past India Gate and on to Connaught Place, the main shopping centre, where armed secret police will mingle with the crowd. Foreign leaders, though, will be taken on a separate route, avoiding the threat of being crushed by crowds. They will join the cortege in late afternoon on the banks of the Yamuna River, where Mrs. Gandhi's funeral pyre is being built, close to the spot where her son and her father were both cremated. India has had recent experience of protecting foreign statesmen at last year's Commonwealth Conference, and thousands of extra soldiers and police will try to ensure the visitors are unaffected by India's new violence.
There was tight security around the south side of Heathrow for the departure of Britain's political leaders. As police watched closely, Mrs. Thatcher spoke about her own security in Delhi, but first she expressed deep concern about the reaction in this country to Mrs. Gandhi's assassination.
This morning, we received a message from Delhi that both the government and the people of India are really both indignant and distressed about the really outrageous behavior of a tiny minority of people in this country who gloated over the murder of Mrs. Gandhi.
This is the celebrating Sikhs you're talking about?
Yes, I think that people in India are right to feel indignant and distressed about that.
Are you concerned about your own security in Delhi?
One is no longer concerned about one's own security.
Prime Minister, it must have crossed your mind, though, surely?
Oh, yes, it's just something one lives with.
It is going to be a massive security problem in Delhi, having all the world leaders,
yes,
people like you there.
It will be. But we go to mourn the loss of Indira Gandhi, and we believe that the Indian government will do everything it can for security, both for the sake of its own people and for those leaders who are going.
Do you
know? We must still go. We must still go.
The Labour leader, Mr. Kinnock, said he was not worried about his security in Delhi. The Indian army was extremely vigilant, he said. David Steele, the Liberal leader, left without commenting.
But David Owen said of the security risks, we have all lived with it for many years. Before the RAF VC-10 took off, Mrs. Thatcher also revealed that she already knew Rajiv Gandhi, the new Indian Prime Minister, and that she'd be meeting him again while she was in Delhi. David Rose, ITN, Heathrow Airport.
The RAF plane touched down at Delhi Airport at exactly 7 o'clock this morning. On board with Mrs. Thatcher were Mr. Neil Kinnock and alliance leaders David Steele and David Owen. Mrs. Thatcher, who so narrowly escaped death herself last month, seemed free from worries about security here.
Concerned about security before coming here?
I'm sure that our Indian friends will do the very best they can. Very distinguished Prime Minister of a very great country.
She was called the mother of her...
terrible tragedy.
She was called the mother of her nation. People obviously making comparisons.
I think that is the right title.
Thank you very much.
The cavalcade sped away from the airport towards the city, the scene once again of overnight rioting and deaths. But the streets they passed through were peaceful enough as the first arrivals making the long trek in from the country past the statue of Mahatma Gandhi, yet another victim of political assassination in this country. Every available soldier has been put on duty here, from the ceremonial cavalry to the thousands who line the route of the funeral procession. Princess Anne is representing the Queen today. She'll fly home, cutting short her Indian tour as soon as the funeral is over. Mrs. Thatcher is carrying extra bodyguards with her during the funeral ceremony. This morning, security was unobtrusive as she too left for the house where Mrs. Gandhi's body is lying in state. After the British party had paid their respects, Mrs. Thatcher signed the visitor's book, pausing to bow briefly at a photograph of Mrs. Gandhi. Afterwards, Mrs. Thatcher said goodbye to the Nehru family housekeeper, a well-known figure to all VIP visitors to India. Mr. Callaghan, of course, knew Mrs. Gandhi well.
A very big loss for democracy and for the world, and India is going to have a testing time and will need all the support and help she can get from her friends.
Indeed, a very sad day, but perhaps hope can come out of it. If India can show the cohesion Mrs. Gandhi tried to establish under her son, new Prime Minister, with lots of vigor and energy, then it may be that there can be another generation of the Nehru family who can build on the foundations that have been made by Mr. Nehru and by Mrs. Gandhi. So it's possible that out of death there can come life.
The house of the new Prime Minister is guarded like a fortress. It is the place where Mrs. Gandhi was shot dead just 3 days ago. She'd been walking along this path to the house when a trusted security guard, a Sikh with 15 years' service, opened fire. Despite the Sikh trouble, she'd asked for him to stay with her because of his supposed loyalty. It was a brief meeting, the first between the two leaders since the assassination. There was no time for more than an expression of British condolence from Mrs. Thatcher before the couple emerged. They were crying "Indira, my mother" from the moment they first caught sight of the gun carriage bearing her body away. Pulled by servicemen and led by cavalry, the cortege moved slowly off through the streets of Delhi on a 3-hour journey to the cremation ground. It had lain in state in the house of her father, the former Prime Minister Pandit Nehru. Although she wasn't universally popular, the Hindu masses loved her, and she'd managed to keep this diverse country of over 700 million people working as one nation. She loved to tell the world that hers was the largest democracy on earth. Past the imposing buildings of the British Raj, the cortege wound its steady way. 4 million had been expected, but fear of riots and lack of transport kept many away. Even the route of the procession had to be changed to avoid passing riot-damaged buildings. In the end, some 1.5 million did manage to watch the procession. It was a brief meeting with only time for Mrs. Thatcher to offer British condolences and no time for politics. The Indian Prime Minister of just 3 days stood to wave the British Prime Minister goodbye. But earlier today, he'd ordered tanks onto the streets of Delhi for the first time to guard police stations in the old city. The thousands of soldiers on duty weren't just there for the ceremonial. And there were many Sikh officers on duty hoping to ease tension, although few Sikhs dared come to the funeral today. The 100 heads of state here walked the last few hundred yards of the procession to the cremation ground. Almost everyone was here. Mr. Nyerere of Tanzania, Secretary Schultz, the most heavily guarded of all, the United Nations, Mr. Perez de Cuellar, and 2 of the Russian delegation. And with them all, the tiny figure of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. In the middle of a vast field, they'd built the platform for the cremation, carried out according to strict Hindu ceremony. Even as the service began, the long line of mourners was still wending its way through the streets and facing a struggle for somewhere inside where they could see it all. The heads of state and their commando guards would naturally have the best view. The centuries-old rite began with decorations of fruit and flowers placed by the family. Mrs. Thatcher, who so nearly lost her own life, must have remembered again how lucky she was to escape death. The son takes a leading part in a Hindu funeral. He must light the cremation fire and supervise as relatives each had their own logs to help the fire to grow. What must he have been thinking, this man only 2 years a politician and now the leader of 700 million people? For a time, even prime ministers and princesses had to push their way through the crowd as everyone began to leave. Among the political friends and mere acquaintances of India here today, there was a near neighbor.
We in Pakistan, their neighbors, joined them in their hour of grief and sorrow.
What about fears that this could lead to a worsening of relations between your two countries?
No, you can't clap with one hand. We are determined to have good relationship.
Then everyone, including Princess Anne and Mrs. Thatcher, had to push their way into fleets of buses for the journey back to town. The soldiers had to be called in to help them on their way. As they left, they passed the spot just a few hundred yards away where Mahatma Gandhi was shot dead. Now another era in Indian politics is over. Ken Rees, ITN, Delhi.
At Britain's largest Hindu temple in Southall, the lights have been burning all night for Mrs. Gandhi. Throughout that time, as police stood guard outside, members of the local Indian community, Hindus and Sikhs alike, have been arriving to pray here. There has been criticism in this area about the way some Sikhs have celebrated the death of Mrs. Gandhi, but it does seem that the vast majority are respectful and will in some way be joining in today's mourning. At midday, a 24-hour service for the departed soul of Mrs. Gandhi will begin here. Up to 1,000 people are expected to gather to listen to round-the-clock readings from the Holy Book.
This temple opens for all those people who believes in the God. So the cause that Sikhs also will come on this occasion because Mrs. Indira Gandhi, not especially for Hindus, she was a great and beloved Prime Minister, all of the community from India.
Many Indian families have remained at home watching television pictures of the funeral in Delhi. For them all, the entire weekend will be devoted to Indira Gandhi and her journey to join the gods. But it's here inside the temple where the majority of the local Indian community will be gathered later this morning to watch the specially installed television set to see live pictures of the funeral pyre. Only then will their main service begin. Terry Lloyd, ITN, Southall.
In Birmingham, the other main centre of the Indian community in Britain, mourners are already gathering at the main Hindu temple to watch television pictures of Mrs. Gandhi's funeral. Their own 24-hour vigil doesn't officially begin until later this evening. A quarter of a mile away, the Sikh temple goes about its normal business, with no obvious reference to Mrs. Gandhi or events in India. Wedding guests are gathering for a ceremony this afternoon, although the Sikhs are concerned about their relatives in India as the death toll grows.
At the moment, what it appears that feelings are running very high, and the Sikhs, being in a minority, are continuing to be oppressed and are being subjected to mass killing. And unless the government steps in and gives them protection, they will continue to suffer hardship.
Sikh leaders here are appealing to their young men to remain calm despite the growing violence in India. Paul Davis, ITN, Birmingham.
A Sikh temple burns on the eastern outskirts of Delhi. Cycle rickshaws have been destroyed. The whole community has been devastated by intercommunal hatred. Hindus, enraged by the murder of Mrs. Gandhi, have ignored the pleas of her son, the new Prime Minister, to stop the violence. Sikhs have retaliated. Everyone has fled from the mobs. Sikh families have taken refuge in a nearby wood. Their homes and all their possessions have been destroyed. There are many women and children. They're afraid of a Hindu crowd gathered just a short distance away. The violence of the past 2 days reached its height in a massacre in the suburb of Trilokpuri. According to eyewitnesses, the narrow lanes were blocked by a mob of youths. All the men in the houses were dragged out, knifed and set on fire. Those who resisted were hacked to pieces. Jane Corbin, ITN, Delhi.
Yes, we saw a tiny, irresponsible minority behaving outrageously, and the people of Britain were angry and dismayed and disgusted. And so were the overwhelming majority of Sikhs, Muslims and Hindus, and they showed it. Do never, never, never be misled by a tiny minority. Just look at the overwhelming majority that feel the same way as we do, and will use their strength to go forward to secure the unity and progress of India.
Is there anything that the British government can do to control?
A lorry still blazes on a country track near Delhi, and we hear a horrific account of how the 2 Sikh drivers had been ambushed as they'd crossed a nearby bridge. They'd apparently been set alight by the mob and had either been thrown or had jumped into the river. Their bodies could still be seen there. For the first time, it's been possible to reach the country areas worst hit by inter-community violence. We saw hundreds of paramilitary police patrolling the streets. And in this community, a full company of 150 soldiers was on duty. Their equipment included light tanks. Despite this display of military strength, the major in charge insisted that all was now normal.
It's just normal. It's just normal.
Situation normal.
Yeah, absolutely, and very fast returning to normal.
But the villagers told us of widespread rioting and killing and of hatred between Hindus and Sikhs.
I don't like to see any Sikh people here.
So Sikh people were killed?
Yeah.
How many?
About 100, 200.
A mob had run down this street, bursting into Sikh houses, spraying them with blazing petrol, and often cutting the long hair from the heads of their Sikh victims. Gruesome evidence in the rubble of their houses. This afternoon, the curfew was lifted in many areas, and thousands were able to go out to buy supplies. And for many, it was the first chance to buy fresh food for 4 days. Ken Rees, ITN, Delhi.
The British MP Eldon Griffiths, a close friend of the Gandhi family, was the only European allowed near the funeral pyre at Saturday's funeral. He has suspicions about the assassination, and he's now in our Norwich studio. Mr. Griffiths, whenever there's a political murder, there are cries of conspiracy. What's fueled your own suspicions this time?
Well, I walked along the path where Mrs. Gandhi was killed within a relatively short time of her death. The blood was still there. I looked at the gate where the 2 guards were, and I was able to speak to those who had been direct eyewitnesses within a matter of feet of the Prime Minister as she
died. The first thing is that it is almost impossible to believe that the only two members of the security force, which is several hundred people, who were on duty at that specific time at that one gate, happened to be only the ones who were prepared to kill her. The arrangements, the rostering, the arrangements that put them on that gate have to have involved more people than just Mr. Beant Singh, who is dead, and the other Sikh who is still alive. Secondly, right since the invasion by the Indian Army of the Golden Temple, the Sikhs have made it crystal clear that they would kill Mrs. Gandhi if they could. And during that period, I have no doubt that the people bodyguarding her could and should have been positively vetted to make sure that none of them was likely to be her killer. One of the two who did kill her went back to his home, which is a particular part of the Punjab where the Sikhs were most particularly committed to her destruction. He returned to Delhi. He was not taken off duty. He ought to have been.
If, as you suggest, the two bodyguards who shot her were in fact themselves shot in a police post and not immediately afterwards, that suggests that other police in the bodyguard must have been in the plot, doesn't it?
Well, it's possible that they wanted to shut them up before they were able to give their evidence. You see, they didn't try to get away. They surrendered. They threw down their weapons, and one of them is reported as saying, "Our task is done, praise be to God." And of course, this ensured for those two Sikhs their place in heaven under the arrangements that their high priests had proposed. So they were the most important witnesses, and the police who arrested them most certainly would, in the ordinary way, have wanted to ensure that they were available to give evidence in the court and indeed to give evidence to the inquiry.
Do you think the inquiry will, in fact, get to the bottom of this in present circumstances in India?
I'm sure of one thing, and that is that the new Prime Minister is determined that it should.
Mr. Griffiths, thank you very much indeed.
We travelled to a refugee camp outside Delhi. The police had strict orders not to let us in, despite pleas from some of the Sikhs inside. Eventually we did get in. It was a large college building, now home to thousands of terrified Sikhs living in squalor. They fled here from many miles around. You could not move in the courtyards without bumping into or tripping over people. Many were washing outside in gutters in the road. Sikhs place great store on cleanliness, and their religion calls for an uncut beard and long hair. Many had their heads shaved by the mobs. "You see, I used to look like this," said Mr. Puran Singh. His identity card showed a proud bearded man. Now he has no beard and a shorn head. The government wants to destroy us, they told us. They were eager to talk about the situation.
We are homeless, we are familyless, and moreover, above all, no safety. We can't imagine how we'll survive ourselves in this India.
The camps are guarded by Indian troops and police. There are at least 3 in the Delhi area alone. At another, just 3 miles away, a food lorry had arrived. The Sikhs angrily told us that they themselves had arranged it. From the government, there's almost nothing, they said. And certainly we noticed a great shortage of food, water, and other essentials. Many of the Sikhs claimed that police had stood by and watched and even encouraged the rioting. And we ourselves had seen police look idly on during last week's anti-Sikh riots in Delhi. A relief worker in this camp showed us his list of dead and injured. He'd compiled it after talking to people in just one block. The list contained hundreds of names. We were told stories of dreadful horror. Mothers whose children had been killed wept as they spoke.
The Indian government is telling everybody that the situation is normal. There's nothing to worry about, indeed claiming that many of the reports of trouble were grossly exaggerated. But at 2 camps today, we've seen something like 20 or 30,000 people, many of them living in appalling conditions, some are suffering from terrible injuries. They're now homeless and they think friendless as well.
Ken Rees, ITN, Delhi.
There already has been a pretty smooth transition if you bar the about 10,000 people killed. But I think from the point of view of the government, it was a very smooth transition. It may not have been from the point of view of the people. I don't think he saw anything wrong in it. I don't think his party saw anything wrong in it. And who are we to complain?
Do you see anything wrong in it?
No, I have there's an Indian saying, you know, Jaise Praja, Vaise Raja. How the people are, so will the king be. So if the people are happy, that's fine.
And do you think he will be the best leader for the country?
I don't know. He has to begin being a leader first. I mean, I have no doubt that if he begins being a leader, just the very fact of beginning in itself will lead to something. He can't get, you know, he has to get better. He may be inexperienced now, but I'm sure he'll pick up experience along the way.
How much is he depending on his mother's name?
100% at the moment. The entire party is depending on his mother's name, 100%. It's a very powerful name, much more so now. Maybe if Mrs. Gandhi had been alive, not maybe, it's a fact, if she'd been alive, then the Congress would have lost this election. But it's a troubled time now, it's an emotional time. And I think people will give a lot of sympathy to the new Prime Minister.
And where does that leave opposition parties like your own in the forthcoming election?
Well, it leaves us where we've lost round one, as it were. But it depends on, you see, as I have said before, the election this time is not important. If the government thinks that by winning the election they have won India, it's not true. They win the election. You know, I'll be happy for them if they win because it will make for stability. But there may be no India to come back to in a few months. They may win an election and live happily ever after. And there may be no India. You know, I don't think I would be happier if they put off the election. I don't think they have the confidence to put off the election because they feel that, all right, let's cash in now while, you know, things are still warm, while the sympathy factor is there.
Will you still fight Rajiv Gandhi in the constituency of Amity, where your husband stood?
Yes, I will still stand in Amity. And I'll stand there because my husband stood from that constituency. It has nothing to do with Rajiv or whoever. I mean, as Prime Minister now, he has an advantage there because every constituency would like to be the key constituency, the constituency of the Prime Minister, no matter who or he or she is. But I'm standing from there on a principle because it's my husband's constituency. And women who come into politics following their husband or their father or whatever, usually it's tradition to stand from their constituencies. And I'm not breaking tradition at this point.
And what chance have you? Do you think you'll win?
I don't know. I mean, I don't go into anything knowing I'll lose. We just have to play it by ear. I certainly think that it will be difficult now. I mean, before it would have been an easy walkover. It will be difficult now because he's the Prime Minister.
The first pictures of the Golden Temple since the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi reflect a tranquil scene far removed from the violence of Delhi and the army invasion here last June. Together, Hindus and Sikhs went to the temple to celebrate the birthday of the founding guru of the Sikh religion. There were no outside processions, but worshippers crowded into the temple's Holy of Holies. In the streets of Amritsar, life appeared normal, with the two communities again trading together.
Half of my family is Sikh, the other half is Hindu. How can one think of murdering or killing or harming one's own relatives?
The prosperous border state is still controlled by the army. The authorities aren't taking any chances. Some commentators believe the current unrest triggered by the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi is the latest stage of a conspiracy to divide Hindus and Sikhs and make the creation of a separate Sikh state inevitable. They suspect the plot, which began in the early days of Sikh terrorism, may be orchestrated outside the country. Prem Shankar of the Times of India believes that with no guiding force, the privileged Sikh community would not have agitated for more autonomy.
The first time I heard of Khalistan, I felt like laughing, and so did most of my Sikh friends, because none of the conditions for a successful insurgency existed in Punjab. There has never been any political discrimination against the Sikhs. They had their own political party and have been twice in government. There's been no religious discrimination, and they were the most prosperous community in the country.
Observers believe the plot centred round a fiery small-town preacher, Sant Bhindranwale, who, with his armed followers, took over the Golden Temple. He began by terrorising the Sikh community and neutralising the moderate Sikh political party. Then he started killing Hindus. This brought direct rule from Delhi and ultimately the army invasion which resulted in his death. The question being asked in Delhi is whether an outside force encouraged Bhindranwale and continued to promote Sikh terrorism with the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi. Both Indira Gandhi and her son Rajiv have accused foreign powers of involvement in the Punjab crisis. There's even talk of American or CIA-inspired destabilization. There's no direct evidence for this, or for claims that the Pakistani government is responsible for training Sikh terrorists across the border. The organisation abroad most highly visible in attempts to create a separate Sikh state is the Khalistan movement, which has support in Canada, America and especially Britain. This group's activities and its continuing threats are causing most concern here in Delhi.
In India, all Sikhs feel the pull of two loyalties, one to their panth, to the gurudwaras, to their community and their religion, and the other to the nation. And they have been extremely patriotic. Look at the numbers who are in the army, and they fought 2 wars on their own land against Pakistan. Sikhs abroad have already cut their links with this country. Their only loyalty, in as much as there is one, is to the gurudwaras, to their religion, and this loyalty is partly even a nostalgic one, a sort of definition of their own identity. This is why their reactions to any government action here would be far more extreme than those of Sikhs in this country.
Sikhs have begun rebuilding shops in the city. The government has promised compensation of a maximum of 10,000 rupees to owners of properties which have been totally destroyed. That's about £600 and would only pay for the poorest of houses. Most Sikhs were more prosperous. Looted property is now being returned to Sikhs by the police, who've been criticised for refusing to protect families attacked at the height of the violence. Today, at the Delhi temple, where the assassins recently took a vow to kill Mrs. Gandhi and her son, the birthday of the Guru was celebrated quietly with none of the usual street processions. Sikhs described the murder of friends. Those who believe in the conspiracy theory are afraid that the Sikh temples or gurdwaras will continue to be the focus for discontent, even terrorism.
I fear that the gurdwaras have become the centers from where secessionists are recruited, where extremist sentiment flourishes without any check on it. What the priests in the gurdwaras say or tolerate, the Sikh masses will do.
But some Sikh leaders are more optimistic about the future. Despite the killing of Mrs. Gandhi and retribution for the army action in June, they reject the idea of a separate state.
Well, I have always believed that this is my country, and I have always believed that this will remain my country. And I think we have a great number of people. Certainly till the 5th, 6th of June, I would put it at 95% of the Sikhs always believed. I mean, they were not part of this whole business. They've been hurt. And when, as time passes, I think they will themselves realize, those of them who do believe still that, you know, we should be separate or something, they will understand that this is the wrong road, wrong path, and they will come back to what I call sanity.
But the army is still protecting Sikhs in Delhi. The government's expected to announce a date for elections next week. And in view of renewed threats from Sikh extremists, there'll be considerable concern about the safety of the new Prime Minister while he's electioneering. Jane Corbin, ITN, Delhi. Bowing to the inevitable, Rajiv Gandhi has brought the election forward to capitalise on the sympathy vote following his mother's assassination. With the mourning period barely over, he's become the Congress party president and moved quickly to take advantage of the Nehru dynastic link. Political commentator Kuldip Nair has chronicled the fortunes of the family and the Congress party over the last 2 decades.
Congress party, well, is strengthened in the sense that they still have Rajiv Gandhi. If they didn't have, I don't know what they would do, because there is very little of program or policy which is they are projecting or have been projecting. So now it is Rajiv Gandhi.
The Hindu states, which stretch across northern India, the so-called cow belt, are the Congress power base. They're the key to the party's political domination. One single state, Uttar Pradesh, returns a fifth of the country's MPs. From the people of this state have come 4 of India's 5 prime ministers. The Congress party grew out of the independence movement. Its workers still wear the symbolic Gandhi cap. Successfully organised at village level, the party has only once been defeated in 1977. But recently, Congress has lost control of a number of states. It's been accused of being dictatorial, scheming to hold on to power at any cost. The party's troubles don't stop there.
The Congress party has become increasingly faction-ridden. When Mrs. Gandhi's younger son and heir apparent, Sanjay, died in an air crash 4 years ago, a large and powerful group of pro-Sanjay Congress party workers were left leaderless. They've become a thorn in the side of the party, an uncontrollable, some say even criminal element that's earned the party an unsavory reputation. Rajiv Gandhi's most urgent task is to replace his brother's followers with a hard core of MPs loyal to him, to give him the freedom to implement new policies.
There are 542 seats in the Indian Parliament. Almost half of these are in the 5 northern states, a total of 220 seats. Congress is concentrating its effort on this area in a bid to retain control. But another power block is emerging in 5 southern states, where regional parties have done particularly well. There are 130 seats at stake here. Some opposition leaders agree unity is essential. Atal Vajpayee of the right-wing Hindu BJP.
When I talk of government of national unity, I do visualize the opposition parties coming together on the basis of a common program. But that common program will be more positive this time, because we will not aim to remove something, but to usher in something.
The Indian electors have a bewildering choice of opposition groups, 27 in all, but only 7 are recognised nationally. These parties are constantly changing, grouping and regrouping, forming shaky alliances which soon break down. Such a diverse and populous nation needs personalities to identify with, and there are strong personal leaders amongst the opposition, but they're short on policies. Indeed, many of them are former Congress politicians who've fallen foul of the party machine. The one policy they offered the people was opposition to Mrs. Gandhi. Chandrasekhar of the Janata Party.
The basic difference between the Janata Party, between our approach and the approach of Mrs. Gandhi was that she thought that she was the solution of all the problems of this country. I think that solution lies in the awareness of the people, in the mobilization of the masses, and in creating a confidence and trust in their power to create a new India. That is the difference between the Janata Party approach and the approach of the ruling party of today.
But Mrs. Gandhi's death and her son's succession have changed the picture. Alive, she might not have regained power. Her death has created a wave of sympathy, and Rajiv Gandhi is cashing in on it. The opposition have lost their trump card.
They have lost their election manifesto, because Mrs. Gandhi was the person they were going to attack all the time. Now what do? They are in a dilemma.
For 3 days after Mrs. Gandhi's death, a wave of communal violence, Hindu against Sikh, swept across India. At least 1,000 people died. The opposition parties were quick to condemn the breakdown of law and order. As Sikhs began to leave their refuge in the camps, there were accusations that local Hindu Congress party officials had orchestrated the violence. The opposition have been making considerable political capital out of this.
We have concrete evidence to prove that they incited mobs in many places. Maybe they wanted to teach the Sikh community a lesson.
But India's 750 million people, 80% Hindu, may decide on polling day that these accusations are irrelevant. They'll vote for the party that offers them most. 3/4 of the population live in rural areas. More than half are below the poverty line. But there's been a bumper harvest. India is able for the first time to feed its people, and under Mrs. Gandhi, real income increased by 40%. Freed of the immediate problem of providing food, her son hopes to extend his mother's industrial policies. His pet project is electronics. He's behind recent moves to liberalise the industry's tax structure and make it more competitive. Rajiv Gandhi is already known, respectfully, as Computer G, and he's surrounded himself with a group of advisors from private industry, the so-called technocrats. But the reality of an Indian production line is far more humble. A family-run sugar factory. The machine dates from the beginning of the century, but still works efficiently. Everyone in the family has a job, which is vital in a country where 8% are unemployed. High technology is light years away, and Rajiv Gandhi's opponents accuse him of an unreal approach to the problems of India. The other Mrs. Gandhi, Maneka, Sanjay's widow. Alienated from the family after her husband's death, she intends fighting Rajiv Gandhi in his own constituency, where she maintains he's responsible for extravagant but impractical projects.
His idea of progress is to put a 60 lakh, that's 100,000 sports stadium smack bang in the constituency, in a place where there's no electricity, there's no water, there are no roads. I mean, I would do small things. I would make them do agro-based industry there. You know, something, if they had cane there, I would make them do a cane project. If they had land there, I would make them brick kilns, you know, wheat husks. That's the kind of thing I feel would bring up India faster than if you imposed something that was foreign.
The Indian people's concerns are local. Monolithic parties like Congress have found it increasingly difficult to hold together the disparate interests of the country, including the Sikhs. Mrs. Gandhi had the power to enforce government from the centre, but towards the end of her life, state after state demanded a measure of autonomy. Her son may have to bow to this pressure.
There has to be a partnership between the centre and the states. States are not third-class municipalities. Chief Minister should not be nominated from the centre.
As the Congress party lines up to begin its urgent appeal for a fresh mandate, it's inevitable that the Prime Minister will be forced to recognise the growing power of the regions. As he starts on the election trail, his statesmanship will be measured not only by his ability to win this election, but to weld together India's disparate peoples. Jane Corbin, ITN, Delhi.
In the vast rural heartland of India, life has hardly changed in centuries. Modern ways still seem out of place in a land of medieval simplicity. Yet it's here in Uttar Pradesh, the largest and most densely populated state, that India's election will be won or lost. Among the poor and backward farm workers whose votes kept Indira Gandhi's Congress I party in power, and which her son Rajiv hopes to inherit. This time, though, the ruling hand of Congress is being challenged, ironically, by another woman bearing the name of Gandhi. Maneka is the young widow of Indira's favourite son, Sanjay, the man destined to be leader. After his death 4 years ago, she formed her own political party in his name, the National Sanjay Movement. Maneka, still only 28, now claims a devoted following of almost 1.5 million. Though her manifesto seems based on little more than the feud with her late mother-in-law and her belief that Rajiv has no right to be Prime Minister.
Well, apart from being immoral, it's also illegal. You know, the constitutional question. Now it's become constitutionally, it's like this, that he was first made and then ratified. So now the question is that tomorrow if I want to be Prime Minister, I just have to go to the President and say, listen, chum, first, here is one guy who signed for me. Now make me Prime Minister and I will get the ratification later. So now we are at the mercy and the whims, constitutionally, of a President, which is not supposed to be there. He's supposed to be a figurehead. But today he can make anybody he wants Prime Minister, and the ratification will follow later. You know, something like getting married after the baby is born.
She looks a pale, frail figure engulfed by the local heavy mob who appear to be running her campaign. Yet she seems undaunted by the enormous task of fighting Rajiv here in his own constituency of Amethi. Thousands had flocked in from the fields, choking the dusty streets of Sultanpur as she was driven to the magistrate's office to register her nomination. She's never stood for Parliament before, but judging by the turnout for the opening rally of her first election campaign, she'll prove a tough opponent, though her fierce attack on Rajiv's weakness and immaturity suggests she has few positive policies to offer. Yet in Indian politics, charisma alone can count for a lot. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10, Sultanpur. These 300 Sikh women had little more than the clothes they stood up in, all of them widows of the violent backlash that followed Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. Some still bore the scars of the carnage that destroyed their husbands' homes and families. Tired of waiting, they'd come to lobby the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi about their plight, demanding better protection, a chance to work, and an improvement on the £660 compensation they'd been offered for the loss of their husbands. The widows and their children now make up the large majority of the estimated 10,000 refugees still left in government camps and gurudwaras, the Sikh temples around Delhi. Although the city is outwardly calm, the women say there's still an atmosphere of tension that makes them too frightened to leave. Most have no home to return to, no breadwinner to keep them. At the Bala Sahib Gurudwara, they sought comfort from cooking a traditional Sikh communal meal. Relief parcels arrived, paid for out of public funds raised by local newspapers, but they still await official compensation. The men among the 1,000 refugees at Bala Sahib are mainly hardcore political activists, more determined than ever to see the formation of Khalistan, their own Sikh state in the Punjab. But for the women, their only ideal is to rebuild their simple lives. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, New Delhi.
An Indian election is a noisy and colourful affair, especially when the constituency is Rajiv Gandhi's and his local Congress party workers are preparing for his arrival. Hundreds of supporters have been bussed in from surrounding villages to the small town of Jagdispur. There are wall-to-wall posters, everyone sprucing themselves up for this festive occasion. The police are out in force, but it seems the only trouble likely is from exuberant Congress party supporters waiting impatiently for Rajiv Gandhi's arrival. The Prime Minister drives himself, his Italian wife Sonia in the passenger seat. This independence causes problems for his posse of security men who are continually struggling to keep up. Indians are intensely curious about their new leader. Inevitably, he's measured against his mother, who dominated the political scene for 20 years. Rajiv lacks her intuitive common touch. He dresses traditionally, but his Hindi is stilted. The speech he makes is the same in every town, only the place name changes. Sonia Gandhi's kept very much in the background. An Italian wife is not an advantage in Indian politics. The security men who surround the couple constantly scan the crowd. Like his mother, Rajiv blames India's problems on internal and external threats. He only rouses the crowd when he demands a pledge of votes for Congress. The people raise their hands. The palm is the party's symbol. The Indian and foreign press corps following the Prime Minister grows daily, but so far he's avoided talking to them. He gave his first television interview to Channel 4 News.
How important is the memory of your mother to this election campaign?
I think it was in the beginning, but now the electorate is really seeing a new hope, and they're looking ahead to that.
And what do you think are the issues in the coming election?
The issues really are two. One is the integrity and unity of India, and second, progress, taking India into the 21st century.
Many commentators are skeptical of Rajiv's political ability.
The way to understand Rajiv Gandhi is that he is a non-politician politician. He has come from a completely different background, and power has been thrust upon him both earlier by her mother, by his mother, and now as a result of the death. So he has no clue of how to handle politics.
In this election, the Congress party will depend on the votes of northern India. Mrs. Gandhi consolidated power here by appealing to Hindu communal feelings.
The constituency of Ameti is in the Congress heartland. Sanjay Gandhi, Rajiv's brother, held this constituency before his death. It then passed to Rajiv. Ray Bareli, Indira Gandhi's old constituency, is just next door.
In the 3 years since he took over his brother's constituency, Rajiv Gandhi has been building a strong base in Ameti. The peasants come to listen to him, grateful that his irrigation projects have transformed their once infertile land. And he's responsible for enormous industrial expansion locally. A multi-million-pound fertilizer plant is under construction, fed by a natural gas pipeline, which stretches 700 miles from Bombay to reach the Prime Minister's constituency. In the last 3 years, £300 million has been poured into developing this area. Rajiv Gandhi believes that India's future depends on modernizing industry and on expanding technology.
Computer education, right down to the village level. We've already started that on an experimental way, but we'll get that going in a much larger scale. We have to reorientate the thinking of our people, reorientate the whole education system. We have to build up our infrastructure, which has lagged behind in the past years, and really get India ready for a quantum leap forward. And we're almost ready for that.
Rajiv Gandhi's own preference is to stamp politics out of the country, is to impose a managerial technocratic state. He thinks very simply. He thinks, the problems are caused by politicians, problems are caused by the illiteracy and backwardness of the people. If only we could hand over the state to a few managers, all the difficult problems can be solved. And I think he's crazy.
Rajiv Gandhi's campaign trail takes him through the villages he represents. Amongst the cavalcade of 30 cars, an ambulance carrying the Prime Minister's physician, a reminder of his mother's fate. There are unscheduled stops at the poorest villages. A community of Harijans welcomes its MP. Both Mahatma Gandhi and Indira struggle to free these so-called untouchables from the stigma imposed on them by the Hindu caste system. In gratitude, they've become faithful Congress supporters. The opposition parties stand no chance here, and Rajiv Gandhi accuses them of attempting to destabilize the country.
Because they have acted very irresponsibly on almost every single issue. They don't realize the implications of what they are saying or doing. They don't have any vision really or foresight. And almost every action they take is detrimental to our country.
Barely has Rajiv passed on his way when the other Mrs. Gandhi arrives, Maneka, his brother's widow, and Rajiv's only serious rival for the Ameti seat. Maneka fell out with the family, and she's accused Rajiv of cashing in on the people's sympathy following the assassination. But her own position is precarious. Before Indira Gandhi's death, it was widely predicted she'd defeat Rajiv. Now she may lose her deposit. Congress Party hopes may be soaring in rural areas like Ameti, but it's a different story in some towns in central India. Lucknow, on the banks of the Ganges. This bustling city, capital of Uttar Pradesh state, is just 50 miles from Ameti. Lucknow is dominated by Muslims who in the past supported Mrs. Gandhi, but their religious leaders have been counselling them not to vote for Rajiv. They're worried he's exploiting the Hindu majority's insecurity by suggesting that dissident minorities pose a threat to the country's unity. As a result, the Gandhi party is losing votes here. Inside their campaign headquarters, 10,000 posters quoting Mrs. Gandhi's last speech are still waiting for distribution. Party workers are worried the sympathy vote is non-existent in this city. A subdued crowd gathers in Lucknow for a night rally addressed by Rajiv Gandhi. security is even tighter than usual. In a city where the people are indifferent, even hostile to the Prime Minister, there's fear of an assassination attempt. Sentries are posted in towers. Men have been arrested carrying guns and bombs at Rajiv Gandhi's rallies. If security fails, the consequences for India are almost unthinkable. There's no obvious successor to Rajiv within the Congress party. But he can't afford not to be seen by the people. There's no doubt he will continue to be their Prime Minister, but it's highly likely his parliamentary majority will be considerably reduced. And winning the election is just the beginning. Rajiv inherits a country divided. His handling of the different factions, some of whom want to break away from India completely, will be a measure of his statesmanship. If he succeeds, he will truly become Indira Gandhi's political heir. Jane Corbin, ITN, with Rajiv Gandhi.